When I look at the global trade data from the first half of 2025, there's a word that keeps coming to mind. It's not collapse or crisis. Those would be too dramatic, too immediate. The word I keep thinking about is distortion. We're witnessing something that economists call front loading, and it's creating an economic mirage that's masking what could be one of the most significant trade disruptions since the Great Depression. The numbers tell a story that seems almost too good to be true. Global trade volumes exceeded forecasts. Container shipping rates remained relatively stable. Port congestion, while present, hasn't reached crisis levels. On the surface, everything looks manageable. But beneath these headline figures lies a more troubling reality. Companies aren't responding to normal market signals anymore. They're responding to fear. Right now, as I speak, U.S. import tariffs have reached 19.5%, the highest level since the mid 1930s. To put that in perspective, during the Smoot-Hawley era, when tariff rates peaked at 15%, the global economy was pulled into a devastating downward spiral. But here's what's fascinating about our current moment. The economy doesn't look like it's collapsing. In fact, if you glance at the trade numbers from early 2025, they look surprisingly robust. What we're witnessing is essentially a massive exercise in economic time travel. Companies are trying to buy their way back to a simpler era when trade flowed freely and supply chains were predictable. But time travel comes with costs. Every dollar spent on emergency inventory is a dollar not invested in innovation. Every warehouse filled with precautionary stock represents a bet against the future. That's the mirage I'm talking about. Companies around the world have been engaged in what amounts to a massive buying spree, rushing to import goods before tariffs hit even harder. It's like watching shoppers clear out store shelves before a hurricane. The activity looks like prosperity, but it's actually a response to impending disruption. The parallels to hurricane economics are actually quite illuminating. When a storm approaches, people don't just buy what they need for the next few days. They buy everything they think they might need for weeks or months. They hoard gasoline, water, batteries, food, not because they're necessarily rational about their actual needs, but because scarcity creates panic and panic creates hoarding. We're seeing the same psychology play out in global trade, except instead of individuals preparing for a weather event, it's multinational corporations preparing for a political storm. Let me walk you through what this looks like in practice. When a company knows that the cost of importing steel, electronics, or machinery is going to jump by 20 or 25% in 6 months, what do? They buy now. They fill warehouses, they accelerate orders that would normally be spread over 2 or 3 years. The result is a surge in import activity that makes the trade numbers look healthy, even as the underlying system is under enormous stress. This front loading effect explains why global economic activity expanded more vigorously than expected during the first half of 2025. It explains why trade volumes held up better than economists predicted. But it also explains why we need to be deeply skeptical of what these numbers are telling us about the real health of the global economy. Think about the financial implications of this inventory buildup. Companies are tying up billions of dollars in working capital, storing goods that would normally move quickly through the supply chain. Warehouse space has become a premium commodity in major port cities. Storage costs are climbing, and all of this represents money that can't be invested in research, development, or expansion. It's economic activity, yes, but it's defensive economic activity, the kind that happens when businesses are preparing for disruption, not growth. Here's where the historical parallel becomes unsettling. In the early 1930s, countries didn't wake up one morning to find their economies in ruins. The damage from the Smoot-Hawley tariffs took time to materialize. First, there was a period where trade patterns shifted, where companies adapted, where politicians pointed to short-term resilience as proof that their policies were working. Only later did the full economic cost become apparent. I want you to imagine a different scenario for a moment. Picture the global economy as a massive supply chain, which in many ways it is. For decades, this supply chain has been optimized for efficiency, not resilience. Components manufactured in one country are assembled in another. then shipped to a third for final processing. This system works beautifully when trade flows freely, but when you start throwing sand in the gears, when you make it suddenly much more expensive to move goods across borders, the whole system starts to buckle. Consider the automotive industry as a perfect example. A single car contains components from dozens of countries. The engine might be manufactured in one location, the transmission in another, the electronics in a third. Under normal circumstances, these components arrive at assembly plants according to carefully orchestrated schedules, minimizing inventory costs and maximizing efficiency. But with tariffs looming, auto manufacturers have been forced to abandon this just in time approach. They're stockpiling months' worth of components, disrupting the delicate choreography that has made modern manufacturing possible. That's what we're seeing now, but in slow motion. The front loading effect is essentially companies trying to maintain the old system for as long as possible. They're stockpiling inventory, absorbing higher costs, doing whatever they can to avoid the painful process of restructuring their supply chains. But this can't last indefinitely. The data is already starting to show cracks. While trade volumes look strong in the first half of 2025, business investment has been more cautious. Companies are hesitant to make long term commitments when they don't know what the trade environment will look like in 2 or 3 years. You can see this uncertainty reflected in productivity growth, which has been disappointingly weak despite massive investments in artificial intelligence and automation. There's an irony here that shouldn't be lost on anyone. At precisely the moment when technological advances are making it possible to coordinate global supply chains more efficiently than ever before, political decisions are forcing companies to make their operations less efficient. We have the tools to optimize global production networks in real time, but we're choosing instead to fragment them. It's like having a supercomputer and using it as a paperweight. What makes this particularly concerning is that we're not just talking about the United States imposing tariffs. We're witnessing a broader retreat from the integrated global trading system that emerged after World War II. The European Union is implementing its own trade restrictions. China is retaliating with export controls. Countries across Asia and Latin America are being forced to choose sides in what increasingly looks like the fragmentation of the global economy into competing blocs. This isn't just an economic story, it's a story about the architecture of international cooperation that has underpinned global stability for decades. When trade relationships break down, diplomatic relationships often follow. When economic interdependence weakens, the incentives for peaceful conflict resolution diminish. We're not just watching the reorganization of supply chains, we're watching the potential reorganization of the entire international system. This fragmentation has happened before. If you go back to the 1930s, you'll find a similar pattern of countries turning inward, building economic walls, trying to protect their domestic industries at the expense of global efficiency. The result wasn't just economic, it was geopolitical instability that contributed to the outbreak of World War II. Now, I'm not suggesting we're heading for military conflict, but I am suggesting that the economic costs of this trade fragmentation are going to be much higher than most people realize. And the front loading effect is obscuring those costs, at least for now. Let me give you a concrete example of what this looks like. Take the semiconductor industry, which has become central to everything from smartphones to electric vehicles to military equipment. For years, this industry has operated as a truly global supply chain. Silicon wafers might be manufactured in Taiwan, processed in South Korea, assembled in China, and then incorporated into products sold worldwide. But now, with tariffs and export controls proliferating, companies are being forced to duplicate these supply chains. Instead of one efficient global network, we're moving toward 2 or 3 separate regional networks. That duplication is enormously expensive. It means higher costs, slower innovation, and ultimately higher prices for consumers. But it also means something more subtle and perhaps more damaging: the loss of specialization that has driven technological progress for decades. When every region has to maintain its own semiconductor ecosystem, no region can focus on what it does best. The front loading we're seeing now is companies trying to maintain the old efficient system for as long as possible. They're buying extra inventory, signing long term contracts, doing whatever they can to avoid the transition to these more expensive, fragmented supply chains. But eventually, the inventory runs out, the contracts expire, and then the real costs start to show up. Here's what keeps me awake at night. We don't know exactly when this transition will happen, but we know it's coming. The International Monetary Fund is projecting that global growth will slow from 3.3% in 2024 to 3.2% in 2025, and then to 3.1% in 2026. Those might sound like small differences, but in an economy the size of the global GDP, each tenth of a percentage point represents hundreds of billions of dollars in lost output. The timing of this adjustment is crucial because it determines how much political and economic flexibility leaders will have to respond. If the front loading effect unwinds gradually, there might be room for course corrections, for negotiations, for face saving compromises. But if it unwinds quickly, if we hit what economists call a sudden stop in trade flows, the options become much more limited. Politicians who might have been willing to compromise when the economy was stable become much less flexible when unemployment is rising and businesses are failing. More troubling is what happens after the front loading effect fades. Companies that have been stockpiling inventory will suddenly find themselves overstocked. Orders that were pulled forward into 2024 and early 2025 won't need to be repeated in 2026 and 2027. The result could be a sharp drop in trade volumes, just as the higher costs from supply chain restructuring start to bite. We're already seeing hints of this in some sectors. The automotive industry, which has been particularly affected by trade tensions, is reporting that inventory levels are becoming unsustainable. Electronics manufacturers are struggling with warehouse capacity. These are early warning signs of what happens when front loading meets reality. The human cost of all this extends far beyond corporate balance sheets. When companies are forced to restructure their supply chains, jobs disappear in some places and appear in others. Communities that have built their economies around specific industries find themselves suddenly uncompetitive. The social and political consequences of these disruptions can persist for decades. I keep thinking about what happened to manufacturing communities in the Midwest during previous episodes of trade disruption. Many of these places never fully recovered. They lost not just jobs, but the entire ecosystem of suppliers, services, and expertise that made them competitive. The same thing could happen to communities around the world if we continue down this path of trade fragmentation. What makes this particularly frustrating is that there are alternative approaches. History shows us that countries can compete economically without resorting to the blunt instrument of across the board tariffs. You can address specific trade imbalances through targeted measures. You can support domestic industries through investment in education, infrastructure, and research and development. You can even use trade policy strategically without abandoning the broader principle of international economic integration. But those approaches require patience, nuance, and a willingness to accept that economic change takes time. Front loading, by contrast, offers the illusion of immediate results. Politicians can point to strong trade numbers in the short term as evidence that their policies are working. By the time the real costs become apparent, they hope to be dealing with other issues or perhaps no longer in office. This is where the parallel with the 1930s becomes most troubling. Then, as now, there was a tendency to focus on short term indicators while ignoring longer term trends. Politicians celebrated when their trade restrictions appeared to boost domestic production, even as the global economy was becoming less efficient, less innovative, and ultimately less prosperous. The challenge we face now is that front loading makes it harder to see these longer term costs until it's too late to reverse course easily. By the time companies have finished restructuring their supply chains, by the time new trade patterns have become entrenched, by the time communities have absorbed the costs of industrial disruption, the damage is largely done. I want to be clear about something. I'm not arguing that all trade is always good or that countries should never use trade policy to address legitimate concerns about national security, environmental standards, or labor rights. But there's a difference between targeted strategic trade measures and the kind of broad based protectionism we're seeing now. What we're witnessing is trade policy being used as a political symbol rather than an economic tool. The goal seems to be to demonstrate strength and resolve rather than to achieve specific, measurable improvements in economic outcomes. And the front loading effect is enabling this approach by masking its true costs. Looking ahead, the question isn't whether the front loading effect will fade. It's when and how severe the economic adjustment will be when it does. Companies can't stockpile inventory indefinitely. They can't absorb higher costs forever. At some point, the new reality of higher tariffs and fragmented supply chains will show up in the data. And when it does, the economic landscape is going to look very different than it does today. The optimistic scenario is that political leaders recognize this dynamic and begin to de escalate trade tensions before the full costs materialize. The pessimistic scenario is that we're locked into a cycle of tit for tat retaliation that continues to erode the foundations of the global trading system. What troubles me most is that we've been here before. We know how this story can end. The 1930s taught us that trade wars don't have winners, they have only different degrees of losers. Yet here we are, nearly a century later, apparently determined to repeat the same mistakes. But there's something particularly insidious about the current dynamic that makes it different from previous trade conflicts. The front-loading effect creates a feedback loop that reinforces bad policy decisions. When politicians see strong trade numbers in the short term, they conclude that their approach is working. This encourages them to escalate further, to impose additional restrictions, to double down on policies that are actually undermining long-term prosperity. It's like giving someone positive reinforcement for behavior that will eventually prove self destructive. The front loading economy we're living through right now isn't a sign of strength or resilience. It's a sign of a system under stress, trying to maintain itself in the face of mounting pressure. Like a dam that's starting to show cracks, it might hold for a while longer. But the longer the pressure builds, the more catastrophic the eventual failure is likely to be. The question facing policymakers around the world is whether they're prepared to address this dynamic honestly or whether they'll continue to point to short term trade data as evidence that their approach is working. Because if history is any guide, the bill for today's front loading is going to come due eventually. And when it does, the cost is likely to be much higher than anyone expects. What's most troubling about our current moment is how little we seem to have learned from past episodes of trade disruption. The institutional memory of the 1930s has faded. The economists who studied those lessons have retired. The politicians who lived through the consequences are no longer in office. We're essentially flying blind, guided by ideology rather than evidence, by political calculation rather than economic analysis. The front loading economy we're experiencing now will be remembered as one of those historical moments when all the warning signs were visible, but the political will to act on them was absent. Future historians will probably look back at 2025 as the year when the global economy stood at a crossroads and wonder why so few people recognized the significance of the choice being made.